So it was timely that you shared that with us because obviously evil and suffering is a really difficult topic.
Yeah, I feel like I'm still suffering, and I want to. Yeah, thank you.
Obviously, we have a lot to cover today, so we actually have two videos. But one thing before we get too deep into it is that I wanted to share a concept with you from our friend Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, who you might remember from chapter 3, week 3. He was the guy who came up with the contingency argument. He also coined this term theodicy, which is an explanation for why God permits evil. And I bring this up because this is not the goal of today. So today we're dealing with the problem of evil and suffering. However, the goal of our topic today is merely to identify how God and evil and suffering can coexist, because it is a problem for Christianity. It's a problem for Christians, particularly because unbelievers see the prevalence of evil and suffering in the world and take that as evidence against God. And surely, even for believers, this is a tremendous obstacle. So theodicy is a comprehensive explanation for why God permits evil and the reasons for that. But that's not what we're talking about today. However, because it's such a huge topic, there are a lot of really good books. This is one that I've read and that I would recommend. This is actually a really interesting one because it covers 5 different Christian views for the problem of evil. And it's a really interesting topic. It's huge, obviously. We could cover an entire semester just on this topic, of course. So anyway, with that said, we'll proceed forward. As Dee is kindly drawn on the whiteboard, there's actually 2 problems of evil and suffering, and within one of those 2 problems, there's 2 versions. So it's important to make this distinction so that if the problem of evil comes up in witnessing to someone and discussing the faith with someone, it's important to identify what problem with evil and suffering that the person you're talking to might be dealing with, because you might spend so much time and effort dealing with the intellectual problem of evil when all along really it's just an emotional problem. And that's kind of dangerous, because if you throw answers at an emotional problem of evil as if it were the logical problem of evil, that could obviously come off as impersonal, and it could make things worse. So, what is the problem of evil? Is evil even a problem? Last week we talked about the objectivity of moral values and duties, right? And how morality is an objective reality. Good and evil are objectively real. They're not just a matter of opinion, right? So if morality is objective, then evil is a problem. But if someone were to deny the objectivity of good and evil, is evil even a problem? I've actually heard a debate with David Wood, where he was debating with an atheist about the problem of evil, and it had never occurred to me until his opening statement that unless you affirm the objectivity of right and wrong, good and evil, evil's not a problem. Because it's all just a matter of perspective, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not. It's an objective reality. So the problem of evil and suffering was framed by Epicurus like this. He says, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able?" Well, then he's not all powerful, because he can't fix evil, right? Well, maybe he is able, but he's not willing. Well, then he's not good. Or maybe he is able and willing. Well, then why do we see so much evil? Maybe there is no God. So that's how the problem of evil is framed by Epicurus. And so the first thing we'll look at is the logical problem of evil. So first is the logical, which says that God and evil are logically incompatible with each other. And so because evil exists, then God can't exist, because evil and God are just totally incompatible with each other. That's the logical version. Then we'll examine that a little bit. We'll have some discussion time, and then we'll examine the probability or the evidential version of the problem of evil. And then finally, we'll look at the emotional problem of evil. So start with the logical problem of evil.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil, but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
So before we continue, are there any comprehension type questions? Is there any part of this that confuses you, or maybe you have some misunderstandings? No. Great. So the point of the logical version, the thing that really kind of stuck with me for a long time was the two hidden assumptions, like, can God create any world he wants, and does God prefer a world without evil? And the thing that I arrived at was that identifying these two assumptions aren't to vindicate God. It's merely to show that if it's even possible that God prefers a world without evil, then God and evil are logically coherent. They can coexist. Alvin Plantinga calls it the free will defense, that God permits evil because it's an inevitable outcome of giving creatures free will. If we were coerced into choosing to do the right thing,
Always do the right thing.
well, yeah, but how would that be any different? If we were coerced into choosing the right thing all the time, how would that be any different from the world that we see now? Would it be
no
different?
free will?
Well, yeah, there'd be no free will, but would that mean that our relationship with God would look different?
You can't have love without free will.
Right.
Well, we couldn't freely love him,
Exactly.
which is what he asks of us.
Right. So our relationship would be less valuable.
Sure.
You also should take into consideration that he did create a world without evil,
Right. Right. So
but we fell because we had the free will.
exactly.
And interestingly, that's atheists would always say, you know what, that is your Bible. That's what your Bible says. Then they go back to the whole argument of
Creation. We don't believe in it.
Yes, exactly. So you see, because you and I, that's one of the reasons why at one point I made it very clear so that we understand. Because you and myself, I'm reading the book and I'm looking at the stuff, I'm saying, because of my Christian beliefs, I was saying, this is nonsense. I will not even go into who am I to try to
missing out on
argue
it.
yes, justifying why God allow evil, and stuff. But you know what? There are folks out there that need to hear this, that need to understand these arguments. And then, of course, we debunk these arguments based upon,
Well, even though we know that evil exists, but we don't have to choose it.
That's right.
Yeah,
That-
but sometimes it chooses us.
Huh?
Like
Yeah.
with his experience, he suffered.
So it doesn't.
Well, yeah,
But
but
it's still your choice.
I think there are things that happen to us that are completely outside of our choice. Now, it's our choice is how do we respond to those things.
Same thing, we either accept the evil and we say, great, I love it,
Or we overcome it.
or we
The
overcome
outcome.
it. It's still a choice.
Right. Right. So one of the problems that a lot of people struggle with is something that Philip's touching on here, I think, is what people call gratuitous evil, which is evil that appears to have absolutely no purpose, right? And so that's actually what we'll look at in the second part. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But one thing that I want to look at is, does God prefer a world without evil? So I've listed 6 passages in Scripture here, but maybe we could just pick 2 or 3. If anybody has a Bible, that we could look at these. Just pick any one of them and call it out.
This is 50.
I think those assumptions also don't particularly speak the whole thing too, because if God can create any world he wants, that's not necessarily untrue. He can if he wanted to, but that's not what he did in our world. He gave us a free will, so it's kind of the assumption has an assumption.
Buried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what Philip said, he created a world without evil. I would say it was a clean slate, but he created it with the potential of evil.
Yeah.
He gave us the free will.
Yeah, and that's another sticking point for a lot of people is who is the author of evil. Obviously, God is not the author of evil if you have a proper understanding of the nature of evil, because then you would be saying that God is the author of evil just because he is who he is. If you have a proper understanding of the nature of evil, God can't be the author of evil, because evil is just merely whatever is not God.
Well, you know, maybe we should study the devil and we can understand why he exists. Instead of assuming there's gotta be plenty. I mean, the devil knows the Bible just as much as God because he wasn't a fallen angel at one time.
That's true. That's true.
So maybe we need to study the devil.
That's a good
To
study.
understand evil.
Yeah, what do I know?
So something I was thinking about as you just said it
Mhm.
was I was thinking, is evil and sin, is it synonymous? Are they the same thing? Are we talking about two different things when we call something evil and we call something sin?
Not necessarily. There's actually two kinds of evil. Philosophers identify natural evil, which would be like natural disasters, disease, epidemics, COVID-19, for example. That's. But then there's moral evil. So there's moral evil, and then there's natural evil. Natural evil would be natural disasters and things like that. Moral evil would be the result of human choice.
So just as an exercise, I was sitting here. I understand the precedent could be made that people say historians have established these stances that there's this natural evil and there's this moral evil. But in general, you know, I wouldn't look at the volcanoes devouring people and call them evil. It feels strange to me to do that. I don't know why. Maybe it's just me. I would. One of the things I'm thinking about with this is like, what are we calling evil? Well, how are we classifying evil? What are we setting up for evil so far? You know.
Well,
There's a
wasn't the devil cast out of heaven to take reign on the earth? So he exists today. He's the man coming to your shoulder and saying, do it. So yeah, evil exists because the devil exists. But if you don't believe that, you're going to question everything.
Right.
And I'm past
No,
that.
I mean, but his question is, what do
What is
we
evil?
refer to?
And I'll add another tidbit here.
Well, let's see, making love to another man's wife. I mean, that one's obvious, so we can pick another one. I can give you 100.
So let me.
How many would you need to understand it exists?
Well, maybe I'm not communicating well. So,
okay.
if somebody one time told me that a sin is anything that, like, if you took an arrow and you pointed it at a target and you didn't hit perfectly right in the center, that's considered a sin. If it's not perfect, it's a sin.
The Greek definition of sin is missing a mark.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so in the same right, you know, like, we call it evil because it's what short of being something that it's supposed to be.
It's not righteous.
Yeah, it's a corruption. It's a corruption of something else. It's corruption of goodness.
So I mean, but if the volcano still erupted and killed the people, it wouldn't necessarily be evil. It'd just be a volcano killing people.
Well, the people chose to live near a volcano. I mean, the people in Louisiana,
Yeah, but
they've broken so many times.
there's
and
no
their
place you can
houses
live
washed away.
where-
They say, I'm gonna stay there because this is where I grew up. It's like the man that was, caught in a flood and people came by to save him. He says, well, that's okay, I'm waiting on the Lord. Finally, the water's all the way to the top. He
Yeah.
says, now I'm waiting for the Lord, and he drowns.
But there's no place on earth where you can live that you would avoid natural disasters.
Not
Two
now.
places.
So God created the earth perfect, but when Adam and Eve sinned, He didn't curse just them. He also cursed nature.
Yeah.
So now we have
Yeah.
these
I
natural
mean, there's some
disasters,
places
famines,
safer than
plagues.
others. You can choose where you wanna go, but no, you're not gonna be completely free.
Yeah.
But I'm ready to go, so I don't care.
So for the sake of time, perhaps we could table this for just a moment. And I think Philip has one, and
Genesis
it looks like
chapter
Laura has one.
50, verse 20
Okay. Yeah.
says, don't be afraid. Sorry, wrong. One verse before. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.
So that's the story of Joseph.
Joseph.
Joseph is saying that all this bad stuff happened for a reason.
It's Hebrews chapter 12, verse 10 and 11. They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our own good, in order that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it.
Did you have one more?
That's the one I had.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
So
I thought I saw you, I thought, was your hand up? Okay. Okay. Yes.
So it's clear that God does not prefer a world without evil. Evil suffering contributes value to the good. So we've already kind of started there, but I wanted to do some table discussion. We've got 4 over here. Maybe we could do 4 over here, and then the 3 in the back table. Let's just take 5 minutes to discuss these questions, and then we'll come back together. So it's 10:54 now. So at 11 o'clock we'll come back together and discuss these 2 questions. So why do you suppose that evil and suffering exists? Why is evil and suffering even a thing? Should we be surprised by it?
Well, my feeling is if you don't.
So the 3 back here, 4 over here, and then 4 over here.
How do you know what good and joy is?
I don't think that evil and suffering are the same. They shouldn't be equated to me. Because, like we've made the point several times, suffering can bring about good. But evil is always free.
A lot of times,
I would say suffering is a form of evil.
We gloss right over that and go, now they know evil. But they never use it.
I would say the suffering
Because they
being
didn't
a result of evil is not in and of itself.
No. I think maybe confusing suffering as an act. But suffering is not an act. Suffering is a corruption of something that is good. So if you're suffering, obviously you're not happy. You're dealing with a situation that's not right. So evil, by definition, would be something that's not necessarily a wrongdoing.
Yeah, why do we suppose that evil and suffering exist?
So the point that I was trying to make is that suffering is a form of evil, not in the sense of wrongdoing. Evil isn't always necessarily wrongdoing, because we saw with natural evils, evil would be a corruption of goodness or rightness. So suffering, I would say, is a form of evil because suffering is a situation that you find yourself in that's a corruption of what should be. So suffering is obviously not the way it should be. So I would argue that suffering is a form of evil because evil in itself is just when things are not as they should be. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, there's 2 kinds of evil. There's moral evil, which is where someone intentionally or perhaps unintentionally does wrong. But there's also natural evil, which would be like diseases, natural disasters.
Because
experience
you don't think
to accomplish
when God created
some kind of
the world,
aid. And
this
whether
is
it's
a
good or bad, we would look at it and we would try to
Right.
figure out what all that means to somehow. So, let's say for instance you're exempted
enter the world.
from
That's one of
the
the
bad things you've done. You're not supposed to keep doing them, but you're guilty of them. At that point in time, you can still use hindsight and different kinds
The
of stuff.
description
Like you're
Jesus
saying.
talks about the inheritors. Does he not say, do not be dismayed for these things must
I
have.
definitely think it's because it's like twofold.
Yeah.
So,
I think evil has a way of
we might see
manipulating
them
it.
as,
You just, you're in the situation, there's nothing you can do about it, so
they
what are you
would
gonna
certainly
do
be
about it?
suffering, but
If
they
there wasn't any evil, I think the
must occur in
situation would feel different all this.
So can good, I mean, I was
We do what we do,
can
and that's
good come out of evil?
Yes.
No, yeah.
good can come out of evil.
Good. So, I mean,
And vice versa.
right, exactly. So when Christ said this, that this evil would happen.
That's always something that I've heard
But he
someone
was
say,
saying,
they say,
be mindful.
when trying to answer all these
Because
questions, that one
you and I are
thing
talking as Christians,
don't
right?
believe in,
We understand,
have a
we
hard time
understand
wrestling
scriptures,
with,
so
is
as to
this
prepare
value,
you
So
to
having any kind of
withstand
particular value,
a
how do you
response or a reaction that would
So
be
there's
as
I think,
disobedience.
I don't know if it's in the next video or it's another
You
video.
know, so you have
It's an
to,
explanation
these
of
things
the training that I
happen,
heard somewhere else, but
like you said, a free will. These things
imagine
happen so
God
that you can be
creating the
prepared.
world
Before that, they
You can be prepared to respond
where
to that calling.
if someone wanted to do evil, they stopped it.
Yeah. So evil does happen, suffering happens.
Actually, no, here's a better example I saw somewhere else.
But my position was that suffering
And he was using
and
like
evil are two very different
He's using
things.
Superman.
I think that suffering can be the result of evil,
Evil,
Superman,
but not
Lois Lane,
always.
and he's dying.
Like in the case of Job.
Superman
Job was
saw
described as
bad
being
people.
righteous, blameless before God.
Well, he got so
But
upset.
then the devil
He was
came
just
to
gonna
him
stop
and said, well, let me
people from doing
go and do my thing with it.
So then he started doing
And
that.
so
and he
God
was
gave the devil
dictator,
permission.
and nobody had free will.
And then he suffered.
So you have the opposite extreme.
But on the other end of that suffering, he became stronger and more righteous. And so I don't necessarily think
You know, even the Nazi guys,
suffering is the same.
Nuremberg trials, whatever, were saying, oh, we have excuses, you know, we were told to do that. For
I think if you put it
for
on
all
a scale,
intents and purposes, if that were the law of the
every
land,
time
you're
there's
absolutely
war,
right.
some
But,
suffering.
I
That's what I'm saying.
Because
Or she would be
that
surprised.
can't be profound enough for all of us to swallow, you know.
I don't think we should be surprised. Because it's
Yeah, I
all right
definitely
here.
think it takes a toll on
It tells,
us.
you know, this tells us we're going to suffer,
supposed to be
we're going to
doing or
experience
seeing
evil
or
in our lives.
accomplishing.
So evil actually makes more sense
The alternative, I
under
think what
Christian
that does is
Yes,
the toll
exactly.
it takes on us.
But that's
Makes sense
only
of it.
because of this book. Now, if you're talking
It
to
has
an
more
atheist,
merits,
they're
probably,
not gonna put any weight in
because
it.
They don't have a reference.
Exactly.
You don't have a lot of choice.
So,
So we're building all of this to this
So
point.
if someone chooses to do
These are
something good
guidebook,
for you,
you know?
and it feels nice,
And,
they didn't have to do it.
Yeah, because when you don't have no
In a
reference,
situation where we didn't have
you can imagine what your
free
response
will,
would
there
be.
was no evil.
Yeah, or because we as Christians have a reference.
Right now,
You know,
how do you talk to somebody that doesn't have a reference
to that,
well, you
because
see,
there was no
again,
other choice.
that's when the evangelist comes in. You try to walk them
Value
out.
to
Kind of answer the questions.
You know,
For me,
that's really what's the
when
worst
I'm
thing
talking to
that's
someone
in
who
lifetime, the
doesn't believe what I
most
believe,
painless thing you can think
I
of.
let them ask me questions.
They may have
You
an
know, because
answer.
if I, yes, if I start providing answers, like you were saying,
Usually when you're asking
logical
somebody like
and emotional and
about
stuff like
evil and
that,
stuff like
you might
that,
be
it's
addressing
obviously premised
an
in a
emotional
negative
issue
light.
with a logical
And they usually have
response,
some kind of
and
instance.
they are not even there.
It's pretty much
You
as
know?
about
So when they ask you questions, then in your mind,
people that
you can
take
answer, oh,
God
this
usually
question is
have
all
a
emotive.
reason why they hate
You know,
God.
this question is
Something
based
happens
on
to them,
emotional because
people
you
get that to them, you know what I mean?
I was a journalist. You know, when I was in Liberia, I was a journalist. And when I go to interview,
But yeah, it is a curious question even asking.
I ask a different question, and based upon their response, I ask another question. So that's how I
Evil
approach
even presents its way
evangelism and
as a negative connotation of people.
That's what comes out. I think,
Yeah.
I think it's, and
heard that called the Columbo check. Asking
my best friend Daniel, almost for a long time, and
because sometimes, like you were saying, you come with a chip on your shoulder, you think you know it all,
this
the
mom
person is
died.
not even on the same wavelength.
Exactly. It's like, well, God is her
Because
real.
you can now
Why
try
would
to
you want
make,
my mom died when I was 60?
give a defense for what you believe. And I like that's one of the songs we sing after the sermon. God is our defender. You know?
He probably kicked off back in the 60s. Was hell-bent on changing his mind on how he felt about that situation. So it's
So we were talking about
couldn't
just
talk
a
to
moment
the
ago.
gratuitous because he already had his heart.
Appears to have absolutely no benefit.
Very bad.
Yes.
So gratuitous evil is what a lot of people
You know,
object
he
to.
has such a
Gratuitous evil is evil that appears to
I
have
think that
no
we're heading
benefit.
towards a different world.
So that's one thing that a lot of people object to. It's actually something we'll discuss in the probabilistic version, which we're about to
Doing our
move
best
into.
to try to contain our thoughts.
Gratuitous evil is what you're referring to, which is evil that appears to have no reason whatsoever.
And I definitely think that in this world, God has
Right,
founded.
right. So we'll look at that in just a moment.
All right.
All right. So if we could bring it back in, should we be surprised that evil and suffering exists? Is it a surprise?
No.
How come? Why or why not?
We just discussed it for 40 minutes. Don't make me say it.
Nobody would have character if we didn't have suffering.
Think of Adam and Eve when they ate from the tree of good and evil.
Mhm.
You know, God had a relationship with them before that, but it was infantile. There was no intellectual understanding of what that meant. Afterwards, they had to work and they had to learn, and we have to learn what that relationship means and the extent and the goodness of that relationship.
Did God know that Adam and Eve were gonna fall?
Yes, of course so. Yeah. Mhm. I think so. Anything from
It's
this
like the
side?
nurturing parent who trusted that the youth were gonna grow up and were going to mature.
We all hope that of our kids.
Yeah.
We just don't know.
I find it interesting that we're born in a universe where we've never not seen sin. And yet we have a prompting inside of us for a universe that smells not like sin.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like fish dreaming about walking around on dry land. It's just, it's strange because as a fish, you don't think about walking on dry land.
Well, there are,
Sprouted legs and-
there are some fish that do.
I don't think those are words.
I wouldn't eat that fish.
I probably wouldn't eat that fish either.
As long as it tastes good. Me and the family were walking around yesterday, actually, at the promenade by Focus on the Family, going shop to shop. And a lot of them have things in their windows saying, hey, we recommend or appreciate that everybody treats everybody equally, no hate, no blah, blah, blah. Some of them even have the, you know, the LGBTQIA flag. We're going to call them Alphabet Club. It's shorter. But it just made me chuckle. It's like, you want everybody to be nice to everybody and respect everybody. But what is this good and tolerance relative to what? Why one person says it's good and another person says it's bad? How are you going to bring those together and just la la land? And no, we're all going to live happy and have like if there's not a God and there's no moral absolute, then is there even good or bad?
Have you heard of the city out in the desert that's forming? It's 85,000 people now, and it's formed in a circle, and you do anything you want to do.
Burning Man?
Huh?
Is that what it sounds like?
I think that's what they call it.
Yeah, Burning Man, once a year, yeah.
Once a year, no, they're living out there permanently now. They're gonna create a city out of it. There, you go out there and talk to a few people, huh? I'm
Who will let you do it?
No.
Why not?
I don't put myself in a situation when I know I'm entering evil just because, and I said, no. That's the temptation that I won't win, maybe.
Yeah.
Stay away from it. But it's amazing to watch them talk to each other.
And us as Christians, we know we're supposed to treat others as we want to be treated. We want to be at peace with others as best we can, right? But we have the Bible and God at that telling us to do so. These people have nothing except for the culture, which changes with the wind. Like, so what is their background? What is your basis? So it just made me chuckle reading. I'm like, what do you mean? What's your definition of good?
Standard?
What's your standard? Yeah.
Yeah, Philip made an interesting point about how, of course, we shouldn't be surprised that evil and suffering exists because evil and suffering actually makes sense under Christian doctrine, right?
Well, there's even evil groups that don't get along with each other because their own evilness doesn't match their idea of evilness. So they have a struggle amongst themselves. Look at all the different ISIS groups and the Shiites and Uzis or whatever they call them. Their doctrine disagrees with each other. So they have the same problem and they're trying to work it out.
Well, I mean, you could say that, but when you don't, not just one religion, but denominationalism, among Christians.
It's true.
It's you can talk about the Shiites, this, that. I'm telling you, we find that right amongst us who call ourselves Christians.
Yeah, I'm saying that Christians and the evil, they both fight amongst themselves, let alone together.
Yeah.
They both don't settle on the same thing.
Okay.
So as we saw in the first half, God can coexist with evil. So it's not a logical contradiction that God and evil both coexist. So maybe we'll concede that God and evil could coexist, but is it likely? Does God and evil coexist make sense, or maybe it's just highly improbable? So that's the second half that we're going to look at here.
At the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil, this argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait, it may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, is far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. Sometimes what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, his role is to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as he can into his unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth, and whatever suffering it holds for each of us, is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those suffering will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, God is good to me. So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, so what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to him or worship him? I feel cold and empty. I want nothing to do with him. You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although he was innocent, he was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose: to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but he loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, he will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
So if you were with us this morning in service, Corey's sermon might seem like he and I planned that, because he talked a lot about easiness and comfort is not the point. That's not the goal. As he was saying, I was just like, God's providence is just incredible. It's so incredible. So for me, well, let's take some time, maybe 10 minutes or so, to look at these questions. How have you gained a new perspective, or have you gained a new perspective on the purpose of life? And does this affect your outlook? And with regard to the emotional problem of evil, how might your outlook help you to share your faith? So we'll just stay with the same groups, and we'll take about 10 minutes to look at these questions.
This week, actually, me and John got together, and I got to share my.
Next time you should they're putting in their assumptions. They're not looking at it from an outside point of view, being objective.
Yes.
On their own opinion.
Okay.
Oh, well, he would have done that.
What
But you know.
Yeah. It was interesting to hear about it. You saw the well, would you say that was your first salvation?
Yeah. We were talking about when I was 5. Yeah, that was the first time, but I don't know that it was really
Salvation.
the most meaningful.
Yeah, that's like me. I had gone to church a couple of times, and especially on holidays, but also intermittently throughout the year when I was younger.
Looks at language and questions.
But it
and,
didn't really set in until I
meaning that if
was
someone would say that's a problem,
7th grade.
somebody else would look at it like that's my opportunity.
And it was one of those experiences where
They
you
do Christian
Hey, D, I didn't write that down. Can you put it back up?
It'll be in the email tomorrow.
You can get it off the eraser. It's on there.
I like that. Get it off the eraser.
And smack your wrist.
And then other people viewing people in suffering, we can learn to appreciate them more not suffer.
World
or
view
why we
perspectives.
have to.
You know, that's
There's
the
people who like,
Yeah.
you know, they lost their legs or whatever. And, like,
But going through the suffering.
they're suffering because they can't walk and they gotta do this. And
Oh.
Unique testimony.
we take for granted. We go to
But that's it. That's it. Because you see, that's why
And it
you
could
can
be
use your,
many different
your
things.
testimony as an evangelism tool. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. And anyway.
All right, so we're almost out of time. This question was handpicked because, for me, this was really where apologetics changed my life. It's important. It's interesting to me that Dr. Craig bookends the Christian doctrines that make sense of evil. The first one being that the chief purpose of life is not happiness, as Corey mentioned this morning. And then the last one is that knowing God is an infinite good. It's an incommensurable, infinite good. The meaning of life. Everybody talks about the meaning of life, like it's this big question, but it's so simple. The meaning of life is knowing God. And so the way this affects your outlook, Dee's written on the whiteboard the word worldview, because worldview is this lens through which you see the whole world around you. And for most of my life, I don't know that I really had a Christian worldview. My faith was just kind of a thing on the side. You know, like when I was at school, I was a high school student. When I was in college, I was, trying to, I saw the world through what I was trying to do. I was seeing the world through what I was there for.
Mm-hmm.
And, my faith was like an afterthought. But I'll admit it took me a long time to internalize and for it to really take root in my heart. But the importance of worldview is really what, is this question is based on, is, this perspective on the purpose of life. And when that's at the center of your universe, when your worldview is centered on Christ, you see everything completely differently. Suffering, evil, it looks different.
Has a purpose.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
And you see the good in it.
Yeah.
So what did you guys come up with? Have you gained a new perspective, or is this nothing new to you? This has been,
That 10-minute talk with my group wore my voice out, so I can't. I'm fried.
I doubt that.
The switch went off.
Yeah. I think for me, it just helped to codify some of the thoughts that were already there. Just to be able to kind of organize and put it in a more easily digestible form.
Yeah.
I taught a class at Colorado Christian University. It was an introduction class on worldview. If you look through the theology department's offerings, you will see a lot of courses on worldview. And I even think there's a bachelor's degree in Christian worldview. I said, for what? But as I was telling my team here, and John too we all have testimonies, right? When I think of what I went through in Liberia during the Civil War, if I didn't have a Christian worldview, I would be in a mess. Maybe I would have died and stuff like that, But it is, how do people live without a Christian worldview? They're talking about suffering, the world of evil, this little brush that I had on Thursday, if I was not a Christian, if I was not looking, I could have reacted,
Sure.
Maybe I would have been calling some of you guys to come and bail me out, to be frank. No, seriously. But when it happened, the first thought that came to me is, Holy Spirit, please take over this, take control over this stuff. And I was cool and calm, and then there was like a battle going on, you did nothing wrong. Why not stand up, to these officers and stuff? But they too would have reacted. So, but you see, my worldview informed my reaction, my response. You know?
You had to do something. You were in your pajamas.
Why did I mention his pajamas?
These two are wearing pajamas.
I know, right?
This could have been a whole
But anyway, I was just, what a blessing that we as Christians, have a God who loves us and wants us to get to know him better, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Knowledge of God.
And think of the strength that we carry when we know God.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's immeasurable.
Yeah.
Albert Einstein got up and answered a bunch of math questions from his class, got 9 of them right, got 1 of them wrong. His class started laughing at him, pointed out that he got it wrong, he's a big dummy and stuff like that, and he pointed out that you can get something right 9 times out of 10 and they'll start chastising you for the time that you didn't get it right. And it always seems to me like people don't necessarily remember people that overcome things, but they do remember people that suffered.
One thing that, just a point that we brought up in this, when talking about the probabilities, is, we have a filter. We don't see the things that we expect to see. We see the things that are out of ordinary, the things that are not supposed to be there. We notice those. Just every day, mothers and fathers make sacrifice for their children. We make sacrifice for our spouses. All of this good that just takes place continually every day in every culture. We don't notice it because it's expected. It is the norm. What we see is the suffering, the evil, the things that stand out that are not supposed to be there. They register as, that's, we notice that. So if you're looking at probabilities, the good far outweighs the bad.
Yeah,
That's a very good point. That is an interesting point.
Yeah. But go ahead.
Well, and the bad is the perfect opportunity to see the good.
Yes.
I mean, when you see suffering, it's the Christians or the good faith that come forward that overcome that suffering that overwhelm us.
Well, it's like when we have a natural disaster.
The people who come to rally and come to the area.
That's right.
When you've got a person who's suffering from any kind of an ailment, name it, and their fellow man comes to them and helps support them. That's the good that comes about from suffering. That's what God gives us as an opportunity to overcome those bad things. That's how we overcome evil.
I remember when my mom had cancer, the whole church came together and every day somebody was bringing us food. And at the time I was very young. Well, not very young. I was 16, but I didn't necessarily see it until now.
Who are those people? I'd like to get a couple of meals.
They're all down in Houston.
He always got something. Anyway, I know time is gone, but
I'll make you something to eat.
Well, I don't know you that well.
Hey, beggars can't be choosers.
John will close, but I really like this conversation, and I think of all the parents that are here, and my minor in college was in broadcast communications.
See, it's the media that's the problem. They're always
it's your fault.
One of my professors, I said, in the class, I said, why is it that every time the media just broadcast or announce or give news on evil stuff, And this guy is like, I think he's 90 now, is somewhere in California, Professor Bliss, Bart Bliss, and he says, class, when a dog bites a man, that is not news. It's when when a man bites a dog, you know, that's when it's news, you know. I'm saying all of this. Parents, we know that as humans, you know, we have a lot of shortcomings. But we bring up our kids hoping that, even our shortcomings, they will be able to overcome them. But so many parents, unfortunately, highlight the evil or the bad things that the kids do instead of reinforcing the good things that they do.
Like,
You know?
eat your meal because there's several kids in China that ain't getting that meal and they're dying. That's-
Well, I don't usually give those comparisons, you know. I mean, like I was telling my class, I asked one of my methodologies, because I was a broadcast journalist, I used to interview, I asked questions, and based upon their response, I ask clarifying questions, and they usually give the responses, and then I reinforce or I clarify or I correct.
Yep.
You know, that's how. I mean, it has been so hard. In fact, my son was just saying it today. My son's girlfriend came to the house last night, and he says, "D, you and Bindu brought this kid up." Well, I said, "No, it's Bindu." You know, but because of my training, I usually just ask a lot of questions. You know, and it is amazing what question asking does to the development of the mind and morality. You know, so anyway, John.
Yeah, I hope this discussion has been valuable to you. Of course, the problem of evil is just such a vast topic. We could obviously talk about this for weeks on end. We
covered it.
Well, maybe one day we'll dive deeper into it.
Yeah.
But next week next week is actually the second of our 2-chapter weeks. So next week we're talking about who Jesus was and is, the reliability of New Testament documents, and then I think we'll spend a little bit more time actually on the second half, which is evidence for the resurrection. So I hope that you will have patience for me next week, because there's a lot to
It's
cover.
a marathon. It's going to be a marathon.
2 chapters.
Wait, we're
and
doing
so
evidence for the resurrection next week?
Yes.
Okay. Along with something else? That should get its own week.
Well, so I figured my logic was surely everyone in this room knows pretty well who Jesus was. So we can kind of touch on that, but focus mostly on evidence for the resurrection.
Thank you so much. You guys have a wonderful week. You know, yeah.
Remember, get dressed before you go outside.